We had a lectern, but I prefer to sit, so this is what ended up being. I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Imran Iba and CAMP, Council of American Muslim Professionals, the Philadelphia chapter, and also the Brandywine Workshop. They are a fine arts institution in South Philly, and South Philly is a nice place for arts. Boys to Men actually went to school just down the road. So if you're not familiar with the book, we can probably talk about it a little bit afterwards. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading the parts. I'm going to read two different parts. One is situated in Pakistan, and it discusses a madrassa, and the other is in the U.S. and kind of discusses family life. As Pops began looking for a place to send me to school, people wondered why I wasn't becoming Hafiz-e-Quran, someone who memorized the holy book of Islam. It's the highest form of learning, my grandmother declared. First you memorize the Quran, said my uncle, whose two sons, Tariq and Muaz, were enrolled in the madrassa. Then comes everything else. Being a Hafiz was considered the apex of human knowledge because of the revered status of the Quran, a status reflected in the names we gave it, the Lohul Mahfuz, or preserved tablet, and the uncreated word of God. The Quran existed jointly with God, timeless, immutable, perfect. The Quran was all Allah, though not all of Allah was a Quran. God had poured it through the mouth of Muhammad, and as it existed now on paper was how God intended for the Quran to look, taste, and sound. The act of repeating the Arabic words as they passed through the mouth, throat, and echoed in the chest was a form of transubstantiation, a way of making what was divine enter the human body. Christians took a piece of bread and a touch of wine, and they thought they had taken the body of their God. Muslims passed God in textual form in and out of their larynxes. I was awakened at dawn the next morning. You're going with your cousins to the madrasa, Dadima said. Then she ordered the other women away from her kerosene stove and made me a butter-fried egg with a flatbread we call paratha. The madrasa that Tariq and Muaz attended was on the bazaar side of town. Ummi was nervous about letting me go alone, but everyone assured her, and so she relented. When I'd finished breakfast, she plopped a topi on my head and handed me a frayed little blue lesson notebook containing Arabic. I walked up the alley with the boys, eager to see my new school. As we entered a square, we came upon a donkey tied to a big nail that was driven in the ground. Tariq threw a rock at the donkey, and the animal's grizzled gray felt quivered. Go pull its tail, he instructed me. Why, I asked. When the devil pulls its tail, it brays. I am not the devil, I replied. Tariq shrugged, and we kept walking. We soon passed the donkey cart. Tipping it over, we tried using it as a slide, with only limited success. As we continued our walk, we passed a pair of dolorous cows and tried to stick hay into their big nostrils, but we were chased away by a couple of barefoot girls with gooey hands and feet who had been piling cow dung into buckets. Muaz told them that they were ugly hags with backward feet, and they told him that his head was squelched in his father's anal sphincter. Rather than taking the most direct route to the madrasa, we ducked in and out of people's houses, asking if this boy and that was awake. Then we abandoned the streets altogether. We entered a cement house, and without asking its owners, who sat on the floor of the courtyard eating breakfast, climbed the stairs to the roof and hopped all the way to the end of the block. When we descended the stairs in another house, we chased a few hens around the veranda and discussed stealing an egg so that we could raise our own little chicken. Eventually, we came upon a large paved road. Here, there were a few rickshaws and numerous horse-drawn tangas, along with fruit and vegetable vendors on donkey carts, as well as boys urging goats and bullocks towards the canals. We crossed the street and entered a part of town even less developed than ours. Not only were the dusty alleys unpaved and run down, but sewage from the nalis spilled out into the street, creating wide black pools infested with mosquitoes. In the pools of sludge, some good Samaritan had laid a row of rocks upon which pedestrians could step. However, they were laid down for adult-length footsteps, so we youngsters had to hop from one to the next with both feet. As we went forward, there were more emaciated cows, more donkeys, and even a big bull with lowered horns. Eventually, we made it to the madrasa. The madrasa was packed with boys and filled with the drone of Quranic recitation. All other sounds, the naked boys outside, the whirring fans, or running taps, were subsumed under the recitation. At the front of the hall, there was a long wooden bench. 5 qaris with beards, turbans, and sticks sat on one side, and an assembly line of students passed before them. Each student held a little sipara in his hand, or a notebook like mine. When he got to the bench, he flattened it out and began rocking back and forth as he pronounced the words. Once a boy finished his lesson, the qari either dismissed him with a wave of his hand, or if the boy had flubbed the reading, hit him on the hand with a fat stick. The boys that were hit took the punishment stoically for the most part, though when they'd gone some distance away, they let their faces contort in pain, and they pressed their hands into their armpits and cried. There was a reason the boys took the punishment to the hands without wincing. Those who broke down while being hit on their hands were pulled around the bench by their wrists, and as they twisted and turned, they were beaten on their back and stomach. The students not currently involved in a lesson ran around the hall. They played hide and seek behind the columns, enjoyed a game of tag, or threw the mosque's straw skull caps at one another like frisbees. An impromptu game of soccer with 2 cloth topies stuffed with straw skull caps served as the ball, and they broke out as I watched, with 20 or more students on each team. Tariq told me to take out my book and get in line with him and Muaz. When you get to the Qari, just tell him that you're new and he'll tell you what to do, he said. Will he hit me, I asked. They always hit, he answered. I looked at my hands and then towards the fat stick leaning against the wall, and I started shaking. The hall suddenly felt deathly cold. With each step that took me closer to the Qari's, little daggers of chilly fear jolted my body. Suddenly I heard something like a crack of lightning and looked up at the dome, thinking that perhaps it had cracked. Loud wailing and screaming ensued. But I soon realized that one of the Qaris had become fed up with all the playing and was taking the stick to any child that he came upon. His preferred method was to grab a boy from behind by the hair or the collar, and in the act of yanking him, hit him on the back, the thighs, or the calves. If the Qari caught a boy from the front, he almost always smashed the stick against the shins. That was what had caused the unearthly cracking noise. As the Qari rampaged, going from one boy to another, there was a mad, chaotic scramble. I began running as well. One of the boys next to me was plucked by his shirt collar and yanked back. I had no way of checking whether Tariq and Muaz made it or not. I was only concerned with my own escape. I grabbed my shoes as I ran past the shelf, threw them down, and stepped into them while running towards home. I didn't stop until I got there. When I told my parents about the anarchy at the madrassa, they said that they were going to look into private tutoring. Pops thought it would be better if I received religious instruction at home. He arranged that an educated man named Qari Adil would make regular house visits. Since he would be coming to our home and we would pay him a lot, Pops asked him to teach me about Islam beyond just memorizing the Quran. Qari Adil was a dark, squat man with a silver beard tinged with henna. He had a gleaming smile and wore nothing but immaculate white clothes with matching white turban. He was articulate and cheerful, and to my vast relief, he didn't believe in punishment. He was the head of a popular mosque attended by many important men. The first day the Qari Adil came to tutor, the atmosphere in the house was expectant and serious. Ammi made the sitting room spotless, and the house smelled great. Food, parathas, and eggs for the Qari, along with a glass of milk, was set forth. A brand new Quran sat on a new wooden holder, and there were Arabic textbooks and 2 copies of Abu Ala Maududi's exegesis. Normally, one didn't study tafsir at a madrassa, but normally a madrassa didn't have teachers like this one. Qari Adil rang the bell on his bike as he arrived, and I went to greet him. It was a gleaming new silver sorab. His comportment was unlike that of any other religious figure I had met. He was graceful, sparkling clean, and he had an obvious sense of fashion. Riding in the sun made him sweat so that droplets fell from his head into his beard. When he arrived, he dabbed the end of his turban against his face and shook his shirt. Even with me, a kid, he had a nervousness that made me like him. When he finally sat down each day, he began by making small talk with me in a gregarious manner. On most days, after I read the Quran with him, we would read Maududi's tafsir, starting from the first surah, the opening, and moving quickly into the dense material of the longest chapter in the Quran, the cow and family of Imran. We talked about Jews a lot, because the story of Moses and his people takes up a large part of the 2 longest chapters. The reference to the cow in the chapter by that name comes from a story involving a special cow that the Jews were asked by God to slaughter, but which they refused to kill on account of its lactic productivity. Qari Adil told me many stories about the Jews, such as the one about Jewish fishermen who were told to stop fishing on Saturday but wouldn't, because on Saturday, to test them, God would fill the lakes with fish, and greedy people, he said, would become tempted to disobey God. He told me of the way the Jewish people compelled Moses to tell God to show himself on Sinai, and then refused to accept Moses' recounting of the event. He told me how the Jews in exile had started to starve, so Moses had God bring huge heaping plates of manno salva, food from paradise. After a period of eating such rich heavenly food, however, the Jews demanded lean legumes and shrubs and vegetables instead. All of these stories of Jewish disobedience and decadence finally reached a climax when Qari Adil announced that the Jews had been turned into apes. In a gleeful narration, he described in careful detail, a mixture of his own speculation and Maududi's imagination, how the actual transformation of a man into monkey occurred. Allah turning people into monkeys bothered me. If I were turned into a monkey, I'd eat lice and be unable to fly kites or spin tops. Being able to flip myself from branch to branch using just my tail wouldn't make up for the fact that I would be ugly, hairy, and loud. Besides, there was something strange about the punishment. It wasn't like the other divine punishments I'd heard about: floods, storms of sulfur, civilizations flipped upside down. Monkey making seemed to be designed solely for amusement, things I hadn't associated with God.